Father Michael Walsh knew he was crossing a line. In 25 years of priesthood, he'd never stopped a wedding, yet here he stood at the back of St. Catherine's Cathedral, his trembling hand clutching a folder that could destroy 2 lives. Through the heavy oak doors, he could hear the orchestra beginning Pachelbel's canon. Time was running out. The bride, radiant in ivory lace, was just steps away, adjusting her veil one final time. She hadn't noticed him watching, hadn't seen the revelation in his eyes. "I know who you are," he whispered to himself. "And more importantly, I know who you aren't." He thought of Robert waiting at the altar, the kind-hearted billionaire who believed he'd found his soulmate after years of loneliness, and of the mysterious woman who'd appeared in his confessional 3 days ago, clutching a death certificate and photographs of a face hauntingly similar to the bride's. Some secrets, Father Michael realized, were too dangerous to remain buried, even on a wedding day. Robert Miller's wealth was America's best-kept secret. Though Forbes had once estimated his net worth at $3.2 billion, he'd managed to maintain relative anonymity in the small Connecticut town where he'd retreated 5 years ago after his parents' high-profile deaths. The locals knew him only as the serious man who'd renovated the old Victorian on Maple Street and owned a few hardware stores around the county. Each Sunday, he'd slip into the third pew at St. Catherine's, bow his head in prayer, and place exactly $20 in the collection plate. Never more, never less, as though adhering to some private ritual of normalcy. Father Michael had known Robert's true identity from the beginning. The billionaire had confessed his deception during their first meeting, explaining how wealth had built walls around his life, how he craved authentic connection in a world where everyone wanted something from him. Father Michael understood secrets after all, the confessional was built upon them. Everyone deserves privacy, Father Michael had told him. Even billionaires. Anna Chen appeared in town on a Tuesday in February, the harshest part of winter, when Memorial Hospital was desperately short-staffed. Dr. Reeves introduced her at Sunday coffee hour as the angel who's been working double shifts in pediatrics. She stood there in a simple blue dress, cradling her styrofoam cup with both hands, her delicate frame almost swallowed by the crowd of parishioners. Robert had been refilling his coffee when she bumped into him, spilling her drink onto the church's worn carpet. "I'm so sorry," she'd gasped, her accent lilting her words with music. "First week here and I'm already making a mess." Robert had smiled his real smile, not the guarded one he offered at charity galas and board meetings. "No harm done," he'd said, helping her blot the stain with napkins. "I'm Robert Miller." "Anna Chen," she'd replied, her eyes meeting his with startling directness. "I just moved here from California." Father Michael had watched their first interaction with interest. Anna seemed completely unaware of Robert's wealth, treating him with the same warm courtesy she showed everyone from Mrs. Abernathy with her walkers to the Hanson twins who raced through the fellowship hall. In her worn loafers and department store clothes, she was Robert's perfect opposite, or perhaps, Father Michael thought, his perfect complement. Their courtship unfolded with surprising speed. Coffee after church became dinner at Marcello's. Robert started volunteering at the hospital's reading program. By Easter, they arrived at services together, her small hand tucked into the crook of his arm. "She doesn't know about the money," Robert confided during a counseling session. "I keep waiting for the right moment to tell her." "And what are you afraid will happen when you do?" Father Michael asked. Robert's expression darkened. "That she'll see me differently. That I'll become my bank account instead of just me." What moved Father Michael most was Anna's earnest desire to understand Catholicism. She'd come to America for nursing school, she explained, leaving behind a childhood of poverty in rural China where religion had been forbidden. My parents worked in a factory that made parts for American appliances, she told Father Michael one afternoon. 14-hour days for dollars. When the factory closed, we lost everything. My father took his own life. She'd paused then, twisting the silver bracelet she always wore on her left wrist. My mother couldn't afford medicine when she got sick. I watched her die slowly, promising I'd make a better life. Her eyes had filled with tears. I want to believe in something bigger than suffering, Father. I want to understand what gives Robert his peace. When Robert proposed after just 4 months, few were surprised. The engagement ring was modest, a family heirloom rather than the multimillion-dollar diamond he could have afforded. She wouldn't want anything flashy, Robert explained, his face softening with love. Anna says there are children in her hometown who could eat for years on what Americans spend on diamonds. Mrs. Peterson, organizing the wedding files, sighed dreamily. They complement each other perfectly, his steadiness, her compassion. It's like watching two puzzle pieces finally connect. Father Michael had agreed, watching the couple during premarital counseling, the way Robert listened intently when Anna spoke, how her fingers unconsciously sought his when discussing difficult topics. Their differences seemed to strengthen rather than divide them. Only later would he wonder if what he'd witnessed was a masterful performance rather than love, if Anna's humble background and apparent disinterest in material things had been calculated precisely to appeal to a billionaire weary of gold diggers. If her vulnerability had been the most sophisticated trap of all. The first shadow fell across their perfect love story 6 weeks before the wedding. Father Michael was closing the church at dusk when he noticed a woman kneeling before the statue of Mary. Something in her posture, the rigid spine, the white-knuckled hands, spoke of desperation rather than devotion. "The church is closing soon," he said gently. "But I can stay if you need to talk." She startled, turning to reveal an Asian woman perhaps in her 50s, her face lined with exhaustion and something harder to define. Weariness, perhaps. Or fear. "Your father, Walsh," she said, her accent similar to Anna's but heavier. It wasn't a question. "Yes. And you are?" "Someone concerned about the Miller-Chen wedding." Her eyes held his with uncomfortable intensity. "The woman Robert Miller is marrying, she is not who she claims to be." A chill crawled up Father Michael's spine despite the warm June evening. "That's a serious accusation. Do you have proof of this?" "Not with me. Not yet." The woman gathered her worn purse against her chest like armor. "But I will. She has taken something precious from me." Before Father Michael could respond, the woman moved past him toward the door, pausing only briefly. "Watch her left wrist," she said. "The butterfly is a lie." 4 days afterward, Father Michael dismissed the encounter as the rambling of a disturbed mind, or perhaps the jealousy of someone from Robert's past. But the warning lodged in his consciousness, impossible to fully ignore. During their next counseling session, he found his gaze drawn repeatedly to Anna's wrist, covered as always by a delicate silver bracelet. "Anna," he asked, striving for casualness, "Robert mentioned you have a tattoo." She laughed lightly, twisting the bracelet. "A small butterfly from my college days. Very rebellious for a Chinese girl." She didn't offer to show it, and Father Michael didn't ask. The second warning came through the confessional screen on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Father Michael had just finished hearing Mrs. Donovan's usual litany of minor transgressions when the door opened and closed again quickly. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned," a woman's voice began in formal tones. Though the sin I've come to discuss isn't mine. He recognized the voice immediately, the woman from the statue of Mary. This isn't the purpose of confession, he said firmly. If you have concerns about someone. My name is Grace Chan, she interrupted. Anna Chen was my niece. Was. The past tense hung between them like a death knell. My niece died 2 years ago in a car accident in San Francisco. Her identity, her nursing credentials, her entire life was stolen by her roommate, a woman named Lin Wei. Grace's voice hardened. The woman who calls herself Anna Chen and plans to marry Robert Miller is an imposter. Father Michael's chest tightened. If what you're saying is true, we need to involve the authorities. I've been to the police. They need evidence, fingerprints, DNA. Things I don't have access to. Papers rustled on the other side of the screen. But I have these. A manila envelope slid under the confessional divider. Inside, Father Michael found a death certificate for Anna Chen, age 28, from San Francisco County. Next came photos, graduation pictures, family gatherings, medical staff parties showing a young woman remarkably similar to Robert's fiancée. Similar, but not identical. The eyes were different, rounder, more openly expressive. The smile showed slightly crooked bottom teeth, while the Anna he knew had perfect dental work. The real Anna had a crescent-shaped birthmark on her shoulder, Grace continued. And spinal surgery at age 12 left a 6-inch scar on her back. Does Robert's fiancée have either of these? Father Michael couldn't answer. He'd never seen Anna's bare shoulders or back. The modesty she'd displayed, always wearing high necklines and long sleeves even in warm weather, had seemed consistent with her traditional upbringing. The butterfly tattoo, he said. Your niece had one. Yes, on her left wrist. Blue with tiny red accents, a tribute to her mother's favorite hairpin. Grace's voice turned bitter. I suspect Lynn has copied it. She's meticulous about details. Why would she do this? Why target Robert specifically? A heavy silence filled the confessional before Grace answered. Lin Wei grew up in desperate poverty. The factory that employed her parents was owned by Miller Tech Industries before they sold to Global Corp. When it closed without warning, hundreds lost everything. Lin's father committed suicide. Her mother died from untreated pneumonia. Grace's voice dropped to a whisper. Lin blamed American corporations, especially the Miller family, for destroying her life. She spent years planning her revenge. Father Michael's mind reeled. Robert had nothing to do with those factory closures. He'd been a teenager when his grandfather sold the company. The vengeance Lin sought was aimed at ghosts. If she hates the Millers, why marry Robert? Why not just harm him directly? Because Lin is clever. Marriage gives her legal rights to half his fortune, billions she could use to right the wrongs against her people, as she sees it. And divorce is so much cleaner than murder. The rustle of clothing suggested Grace was standing to leave. She's done this before, Father. 2 other wealthy men, though none as rich as Robert. She dates them, sometimes becomes engaged, then disappears with whatever she can take. I need more than your word, Father Michael said. Something concrete. I've hired an investigator. He's tracking down Lin's previous victims, assembling evidence the police will act on. But the wedding is in 3 weeks. Her voice cracked slightly. My niece deserves justice, Father. And Robert deserves the truth before he makes the biggest mistake of his life. After Grace left, Father Michael sat alone in the gathering darkness of the church, the folder heavy in his hands. Outside, summer thunder rolled across the Connecticut hills, promising a storm that felt prophetic. He had counseled countless couples through periods of doubt, had mediated family conflicts, helped heal marriages fractured by betrayal. But this was different. If Grace were telling the truth, the beautiful love story he had witnessed was actually a calculated revenge plot spanning decades and continents. Yet who was he to destroy a relationship based on unproven allegations? What if Grace was delusional, or had her own motives for wanting to stop the wedding? That night, Father Michael did something he hadn't done in years. He called his old seminary roommate, now working in the San Francisco diocese. "I need a favor, Edward," he said after explaining the situation. "Can you confirm whether an Anna Chen died there 2 years ago? And whether she was a nurse at San Francisco General?" 3 days later, Edward called back. "There's a memorial plaque in the pediatric ward," he said grimly. "Anna Chen, beloved nurse, 1991 to 2021. Her colleagues still leave flowers." As Father Michael hung up the phone, he knew with sickening certainty that the perfect bride walking down his church's aisle in less than 3 weeks was living a lie. The question now was what that lie would cost, and who would pay the steepest price. The church glowed with afternoon light filtering through stained glass, casting jewel-toned shadows across the altar where, in less than 24 hours, Robert and Anna would exchange their vows. White roses and ivy garlands adorned every pew, the air held the mingled scents of beeswax candles and Mrs. Peterson's lemon furniture polish. Everything was perfect, a stage set for sacred promises that Father Michael now feared were built on the most profane of deceptions. He found the couple in the side chapel, Robert adjusting his tie in the reflection of a brass candlestick while Anna checked items off a list on her phone. They looked like any other couple on the eve of their wedding, excited, nervous, caught in that liminal space between their separate pasts and shared future. "There he is." Robert smiled broadly. "The man of the hour." Father Michael forced himself to return the smile, though his stomach churned with the knowledge that pressed against his conscience like a stone. Grace Chen's investigator had delivered a final report that morning, documentation of Lin Wei's previous identities, statements from 2 men she'd targeted before, financial records showing systematic fraud across 3 states. And most damning of all, side-by-side photos of the real Anna's butterfly tattoo beside a close-up of the one on Lin's wrist. Similar at first glance, but under magnification, clearly different. The real Anna's had the tiny red accents Grace had described. Lin's was a rushed copy, the work of a tattoo artist who'd cared more about speed than detail. The evidence sat in Father Michael's office safe, waiting for tomorrow. He'd made his decision after hours of prayer and moral wrestling. He would perform the objection portion of the ceremony, giving Grace the opportunity to present her evidence. It wasn't ideal, but it would ensure that whatever happened, justice would prevail in the light of day, not in whispers and allegations. "Shall we go through the final details?" he asked, gesturing toward the front pew. As they sat together, Father Michael studied the woman beside Robert. Lin Wei, for he could no longer think of her as Anna, was the picture of bridal anticipation. Her slim fingers traced the order of service, her smile widened at the mention of the string quartet Robert had surprised her with. If she was playing a role, her performance deserved every acting award Hollywood offered. "Father, I've been meaning to ask," she said, her voice soft with the accent he now knew was partially affected, "about the objection part of the ceremony. Have you reconsidered removing it?" Father Michael met her gaze steadily. "I'm afraid not. Robert requested a traditional service, and that element is part of our standard liturgy. Something flickered behind her eyes, a momentary calculation that sent a chill through him. "It's just so old-fashioned," she persisted. "Nobody actually objects at weddings anymore." Robert laughed, squeezing her hand. "Worried about one of my ex-girlfriends showing up?" "Of course not," she replied, leaning against his shoulder affectionately. "I just don't want anything to interrupt our perfect day." Father Michael cleared his throat. "I actually wanted to ask you both something. It's a tradition in my family to offer newlyweds a special blessing that includes acknowledgement of physical marks that make each person unique: scars, birthmarks, things that tell your life story. Would you be comfortable with that?" Robert nodded immediately. "Sounds meaningful. I've got that appendectomy scar and the one on my knee from college lacrosse." Father Michael turned to Linear. "And you, Anna? Any distinctive marks?" She hesitated, almost imperceptibly. "Just my butterfly tattoo," she said lightly. "I'm fortunate to have made it through childhood without major injuries." The lie hung in the air between them. According to Grace, the real Anna's back bore a long surgical scar, evidence of the spinal procedure that had saved her from crippling scoliosis as a child. A detail Lynn couldn't replicate, no matter how thorough her research. "Actually," Robert interjected, "you have that little crescent birthmark on your right shoulder. Remember? I noticed it the first time we went swimming." Lynn's face remained composed, though something tightened around her mouth. "Oh, that tiny thing? I forget it's even there." Father Michael felt his pulse quicken. Grace had mentioned a crescent birthmark, but on the left shoulder, not the right. Either Grace was wrong about this detail, or Lynn had somehow created a false birthmark to support her deception. "Well," Father Michael said, rising abruptly, "I should check on the altar flowers. Mrs. Donovan's arrangements sometimes need adjusting." "I'll walk you out," Lynn offered, standing before Robert could. "I want to check on something in the bridal room anyway." In the shadowed corridor between the chapel and main sanctuary, Lynn stopped Father Michael with a light touch on his arm. Her face had changed completely, the warmth replaced by sharp assessment. "Is something wrong, Father?" she asked, her accent suddenly less pronounced. "You seem troubled today." He met her gaze directly. "Nothing that can't be resolved tomorrow, Anna." "Really?" "Because I can't shake the feeling you've been investigating me." Her fingers tightened slightly on his arm. "Has someone been telling you stories? Making accusations? Would there be reason for concern if they had?" Lynn released his arm, stepping back to study his face. The mask of Anna Chen, the sweet, compassionate nurse who'd captured Robert's heart, slipped further, revealing edges of something harder beneath. "Everyone has secrets, Father," she said finally. "Even Robert? Did you know his grandfather's company destroyed entire villages in China? Families ruined, lives lost, all for corporate profit margins." Her voice took on a bitter edge. "Some would say justice comes in many forms. Is that what tomorrow is to you? Justice?" For a moment just a flicker genuine emotion crossed her face. Something like regret, or perhaps the ghost of what might have been in another lifetime. "It started that way," she admitted. "But things change. People change. Not their pasts," Father Michael countered quietly. "Those remain what they are, no matter what names we call ourselves now." Lynn's expression hardened again. "Be careful, Father. Some truths hurt innocent people. Robert loves who I am today, who I've become with him. Isn't that what matters most?" Before he could answer, the door to the chapel opened and Robert appeared, his face lighting up at the sight of his bride-to-be. "There you are. Mom's on the phone, wants to know if we're still having brunch before the honeymoon flight tomorrow." Lynn turned to him, her transformation back to Anna completed in an instant, the gentle smile, the slight shyness, the perfect picture of a woman in love. "Of course, darling. Whatever makes her happy." As Robert led her away, Lynn glanced back at Father Michael, a silent warning in her eyes. The message was clear: interfere, and people get hurt. Father Michael watched them go, the weight of his knowledge pressing down like a physical burden. In less than 24 hours, he would stand before God and his congregation, asking if anyone knew just cause why these two should not be joined in holy matrimony. And someone would answer. That night, alone in his small room at the rectory, Father Michael knelt beside his bed, not in his usual evening prayers but in a deeper, more desperate petition. Outside, lightning split the summer sky, thunder following like God's own commentary on the moral storm raging within him. "Guide me," he whispered into clasped hands. "Show me how truth and mercy can coexist tomorrow." The answer came not in divine revelation but in the buzzing of his phone on the nightstand. A text message from an unknown number. "This is Grace Chan. The FBI will be at the church tomorrow. Be prepared for anything. She knows we're onto her." Father Michael closed his eyes, the die now fully cast. Whatever happened tomorrow, innocence and deception would finally face each other in the harsh light of truth, and he would be the one who had brought them together. St. Catherine's had never looked more beautiful. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting kaleidoscope patterns across the marble floors. Flower arrangements transformed ordinary wooden pews into something from a fairy tale, and the string quartet in the corner filled the vast space with Pachelbel's canon as elegantly dressed guests found their seats. Father Michael stood in the vestibule, his ceremonial robes feeling unusually heavy across his shoulders. He nodded mechanically to familiar faces: the Hendersons from the parish council, Dr. Reeves from the hospital, Robert's golf partners and business associates. The bride's side held fewer guests, mostly hospital colleagues and a scattering of supposed friends from California who Father Michael now suspected had been paid to attend. There was no family representing Anna Chan, a convenient circumstance that had raised no flags until Grace's revelations. Two plainclothes FBI agents positioned themselves discreetly at the back of the church. Agent Ramirez, the lead investigator, had briefed Father Michael that morning. "We have sufficient evidence for an arrest, but we need positive identification first," she'd explained. "Grace Chen will make the initial objection, then we'll take over. Try to keep things calm until we move in." As if a wedding imploding could ever be calm. Robert waited at the altar, handsome in his tailored tuxedo, his face alight with the particular joy of a man who believes his loneliness is finally ending. Seeing him there so trusting, so open made Father Michael's chest ache with the knowledge of what was coming. The music shifted. Bridesmaids processed down the aisle in pale blue silk, followed by Robert's niece scattering rose petals from a silver basket. Then the traditional pause, the shifting of the congregation as everyone rose and turned expectantly toward the doors. The wedding march began, and there she was, the woman calling herself Anna Chen, a vision in ivory lace and satin. Her dark hair was swept up beneath a cathedral-length veil, her makeup flawless, her smile radiant as she took her first steps toward the altar. Toward Robert. Toward a future built on lies so intricate that even Father Michael, trained to look for signs of doubt or deception in couples, had been completely convinced. As she passed him, Lynn's eyes met his briefly. Something passed between them, a silent acknowledgement that they both knew what was at stake. For a moment, Father Michael thought he glimpsed genuine emotion in her expression, not calculation but something like resignation mixed with defiance. The ceremony began as hundreds had before it. Father Michael's voice remained steady as he welcomed the congregation and spoke of marriage's sacred covenant. He led the couple through the initial prayers, trying not to notice how Lynn's hand trembled slightly in Robert's larger one. A friend read from Corinthians, "Love is patient, love is kind," while Lynn stared fixedly at a point above the altar, her jawline tightening almost imperceptibly. Robert kept glancing at his bride with naked adoration, completely unaware of the devastation hovering just minutes away. Father Michael's mouth went dry as the readings concluded. The moment of truth had arrived literally. If anyone can show just cause why this couple cannot lawfully be joined together in matrimony, he said, his voice carrying to the farthest corners of the church, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. The traditional silence lasted 3 heartbeats. Then a rustle from the back of the church as Grace Chen stood, her face pale but determined. "I object," she said clearly, her voice wavering only slightly. "The woman standing there is not Anna Chan." A collective gasp rose from the congregation. Robert's face contorted in confusion as he turned toward the voice. Lynn went absolutely still, her bouquet clutched so tightly that a white rose stem snapped audibly in the shocked silence. "My niece, the real Anna Chan, died 2 years ago in San Francisco," Grace continued, moving into the center aisle. "This woman is Lin Wei, her former roommate. She stole my niece's identity, her credentials, her entire life." "What is this?" Robert whispered, turning to his bride. "Anna, what's she talking about?" Lynn didn't answer, her eyes darting toward the side exits where the FBI agents had moved to block any escape. "I have documentation," Grace said, moving closer, pulling papers from her purse. "Anna's death certificate. Photos. Evidence of previous identities this woman has used." "This is absurd," Lynn finally spoke, her voice carrying a harder edge than the congregation had ever heard from the gentle nurse they thought they knew. "This woman is clearly disturbed. I've never seen her before in my life." FBI agent Ramirez stepped forward, her badge now visible. "Ms. Wei, we have fingerprint matches from your previous identities as Susan Park in Seattle and Lisa Wong in Los Angeles. We've spoken to Thomas Bradford and James Liu, the men you targeted before Robert Miller." The church erupted in murmurs and gasps. Someone in the back row was already recording on their phone, tomorrow's viral sensation in the making. "Anna." Robert's voice cracked as he turned to the woman beside him. "Tell me this isn't true. Tell me they're mistaken." For a long moment, Lynn stood frozen in place, calculations visibly racing behind her eyes. Father Michael could almost see her weighing options, escape routes, possible narratives that might salvage something from the catastrophe unfolding around her. Then, with a suddenness that startled everyone, her posture completely changed. The demure, slightly shy affect she'd maintained for months disappeared, replaced by a cold dignity that transformed her face into something harder, sharper. "My real name is Lin Wei," she said, addressing Robert directly, ignoring everyone else in the church. "Anna Chen was my roommate in nursing school. She died in a car accident 2 years ago." Robert staggered slightly, his best man reaching out to steady him. "Why?" he whispered. "Why me?" "Because your family destroyed mine," Lynn replied, her voice now entirely free of the accent she'd affected. "Miller Tech owned the factory in my village before selling to Global Corp. When it closed without warning, my father killed himself. My mother died because we couldn't afford basic medicine. Her eyes blazed with a fury that had clearly been burning for decades. I was 14 years old, left with nothing. That's not possible, Robert said, his face ashen. My grandfather sold that company years before. To people who did exactly what he would have done, Lin cut him off. American corporations, Chinese factories, disposable workers. Different names, same exploitation. Agent Ramirez stepped closer. Ms. Wei, you need to come with us. We have warrants for your arrest in 3 states. Lin's eyes never left Robert's face. I plan to take half your fortune in the divorce, she continued, as if the FBI agent hadn't spoken. Use it to help the families your privilege has destroyed. It was justice. Symmetry. And us. Robert's voice broke on the question. Everything between us, was any of it real? For the first time, Lin's composure cracked. Something like genuine pain flashed across her features before she mastered it again. It wasn't supposed to be, she admitted quietly. You were just a target. The perfect symbolic revenge. She paused, vulnerability momentarily visible. I didn't expect you to be kind. I didn't expect to care about the children at the hospital, the community here, the work we did together. But you lied about everything, Robert said, anger finally breaking through his shock. Your name, your past, your family, how could anything between us be real? Before Lin could answer, Agent Ramirez moved forward, another agent flanking her. Ms. Wei, please come with us now. For a moment, it seemed Lin might resist. Her eyes darted again toward the exits, her body tensing like a cornered animal's. Then, with a small, resigned nod, she handed her bouquet to a stunned bridesmaid. As the agents led her down the aisle, past the shocked faces of guests who had come to celebrate love and now found themselves witnesses to spectacular deception, Lin stopped briefly beside Grace Chan. I'm sorry about Anna, she said softly. She was kind to me when no one else was. She deserved better. Grace's face remained impassive, though tears glittered in her eyes. Yes. She did. Father Michael watched as Lin Wei, the woman who had nearly become Mrs. Robert Miller through the most elaborate of lies, was escorted from the church, her wedding gown whispering across the marble floor like the ghost of what might have been. At the altar, Robert stood motionless, the perfect stillness of a man whose entire reality had just imploded. Around him, chaos erupted, guests talking over each other, phones recording, bridesmaids crying. The perfect wedding had become a spectacle of public humiliation and private devastation. Everyone please, Father Michael finally called, raising his hands. Let's give Mr. Miller some privacy. This ceremony is obviously concluded. As the congregation reluctantly began to disperse, Robert turned to Father Michael, his face stripped of everything but raw pain. Did you know? He asked simply. Father Michael met his gaze honestly. Not until recently. I hoped I was wrong. Robert nodded once, then walked alone down the aisle and out the side door, leaving behind the flowers, the music, and every dream he'd built around a woman who had never really existed at all. The media descended like vultures on fresh carrion. By nightfall, camera crews clogged the streets surrounding St. Catherine's Church, reporters shoved microphones toward shell-shocked wedding guests, and #billionaire bride scam trend nationally on Twitter. The story had everything: wealth, revenge, romance, deception wrapped in the irresistible package of a wedding spectacle gone horrifically wrong. Billionaire targeted in elaborate revenge plot, screamed the cable news chirons. Bride revealed as identity thief with a vendetta. Father Michael refused all interview requests, pulling the rectory blinds against the camera lenses that tracked his movements. He had expected fallout, but nothing like this feeding frenzy, this transformation of private pain into public entertainment. Robert had disappeared immediately after the ceremony, whisked away by his security team to an undisclosed location. Lin Wei was in federal custody, facing multiple charges across several jurisdictions. And Father Michael was left alone with the weight of what had happened in his church, the sacred space where truth had detonated like a bomb, leaving no one unscathed. 3 days after the wedding that wasn't he, Father Michael received a text from Robert asking to meet. Not at the church or rectory where reporters lurked, but at Lookout Point, a secluded spot overlooking the valley where locals sometimes went to watch sunsets or meteor showers. Robert was already there when Father Michael arrived, leaning against the hood of his Range Rover, staring out at the darkening landscape below. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, unshaven, hair uncombed, wearing jeans and a rumpled Columbia sweatshirt that made him appear younger and more vulnerable than his tailored suits ever had. "Thank you for coming," Robert said, not turning his head. Father Michael stood beside him, giving him the space to speak or remain silent as needed. Sometimes presence was more valuable than words. "They let me see her yesterday," Robert finally said. "At the detention center." Father Michael looked at him in surprise. "That couldn't have been easy." "I had to know." Robert's hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. "I had to understand how someone could do what she did, how every word, every touch between us could be calculated manipulation." "And did you get your answers?" Robert laughed hollowly. "Not the ones I expected." He finally turned to face Father Michael. "She showed me photos of her village after the factory closed. Children begging in streets. Elderly people dying without care. Families torn apart when parents went to cities for work, never returning. That doesn't excuse what she did to you." "No," Robert agreed. "But it helps me understand where that kind of desperation comes from." He shook his head slowly. "My grandfather built his fortune during the manufacturing exodus to China. Low wages, no environmental regulations, no worker protections. We benefited directly from other people's exploitation even if we were officially removed from that particular factory by the time Lin's family worked there. You're not responsible for corporate decisions made before you were born," Father Michael reminded him gently. "Maybe not. But I'm responsible for what I do with that knowledge now." Robert's face hardened with resolve. "I've spent the last 2 days researching which villages were destroyed by factories my family once owned. How many Lin Weiss are out there, Father? How many people with legitimate grievances have I been blind to?" Father Michael chose his next words carefully. "Acknowledging systemic injustice is important. But what she did to you personally, the deception, the manipulation of your feelings, that wasn't justice. That was cruelty. That's the hell of it," Robert said, his voice suddenly raw with emotion. "She says she fell in love with me for real. That somewhere between the revenge plot and the wedding plans, her feelings became genuine." He ran a hand roughly through his hair. "How am I supposed to know what was real and what wasn't? Every memory is poisoned now." A coyote called in the distance, the sound echoing across the valley as darkness settled more firmly around them. Father Michael thought of the thousands of weddings he'd performed, the vows pledging honesty, fidelity, commitment. What happened when the most fundamental promise to be who you claimed to be was broken before all the others? "The FBI found her journal," Robert continued. "Pages and pages documenting her plan, tracking my routines, noting my preferences so she could become the perfect match. His voice cracked slightly. But the last few months, the entries changed. She stopped writing about revenge and started writing about feeling guilty. About wishing we'd met differently. Do you believe her? Robert stared out at the twinkling lights of the town below. I don't know what I believe anymore. Silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of betrayal and the wreckage of what might have been. There's something else, Robert said finally. Lin asked me to find the real Anna Chen's family in China. To tell them what happened to her, since the hospital just reported her as deceased with no details. She wants them to know their daughter was loved and respected by her colleagues. Father Michael raised an eyebrow. That seems oddly considerate for someone who stole the woman's identity. That's what I can't reconcile, Robert admitted. The calculated monster who targeted me for years versus the woman who spent her own money buying toys for kids at the hospital. Who sat with dying patients on her days off. Who cried real tears when we visited that homeless shelter together. He shook his head in frustration. People aren't supposed to be both, are they? Villains and heroes in the same skin. Most of us contain multitudes, Father Michael said quietly. The capacity for cruelty and kindness, for deception and truth. We all have origin stories that shape us, wounds that drive us. Lin's choices were her own, but the pain that motivated them was real. Robert was silent for a long moment. I've decided to cancel the resort development in Malaysia, he said abruptly. There's a fishing village that would be displaced. 300 families who've lived there for generations. Because of Lin. Because it's the right thing to do, Robert corrected him. Maybe the only good thing to come from this mess is that I'm finally seeing clearly what my wealth actually means in the world, the power it gives me to help or harm. A light rain began to fall, soft drops pattering on the car roof and dampening their shoulders. What will happen to her? Father Michael asked as they moved to get inside the vehicle. Minimum security prison, probably. Her lawyer thinks 3 to 5 years with the plea deal they're offering. Robert started the engine but didn't put the car in gear. The prosecutor says she's providing information about a larger identity theft ring. Trading names for a reduced sentence. And afterward, deportation, most likely. Robert's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Back to China, where she'll have nothing again. The perfect circular justice of the system. Father Michael heard something in Robert's voice, a reluctant compassion battling with his justified anger. You know what's strangest of all? Robert asked, rain streaking down the windshield in rivulets that distorted the world outside. Part of me still misses her. Not Lin Wei the identity thief, but Anna Chen, the woman I thought I knew. The person I woke up every morning excited to see. He laughed bitterly. How pathetic is that? It's not pathetic to mourn what you thought you had, Father Michael said gently. The love you felt was real, even if the person you gave it to wasn't who she claimed to be. As they drove back toward town, the church spire became visible in the distance, illuminated against the night sky. Father Michael thought about the wedding that should have happened there, the sacred promises, the joining of two lives. Instead, the church had become the scene of an unmasking, where painful truth replaced comforting deception. I keep wondering, Robert said as they approached the town limits, if she had gone through with it, if we had married, built a life together, would I ever have known? Or would I have lived happily with a lie that felt like love? Father Michael had no answer. Some questions echoed without resolution, like prayers sent into the darkness with no guarantee of response. All he knew was that in that church, beneath the stained glass and flickering candles, something both terrible and necessary had happened. The truth, with all its jagged edges, had finally come to light. 6 months passed. Seasons turned. The media circus eventually packed up its tents and moved on to newer scandals, leaving St. Catherine's Church to return to its quiet rhythms of Sunday services and community suppers. Father Michael had weathered the storm: the angry calls from parishioners who felt the church had been tarnished, the awkward questions from colleagues about how he'd missed the signs of deception, the lingering whispers that followed him through town. He had done what conscience demanded, but the cost had been steep. December brought early snow and the annual Christmas pageant preparations. Father Michael was arranging the nativity scene when he heard the church door open behind him. He turned to find Robert standing in the entrance, snowflakes melting on the shoulders of his charcoal overcoat. "I wasn't sure you'd come back here," Father Michael said, setting down the carved wooden shepherd he'd been positioning. Robert moved slowly up the center aisle, his footsteps echoing in the empty church. "Neither was I." He looked different, leaner, more weathered somehow, but with a steadiness to his gaze that hadn't been there before. "You've been traveling," Father Michael observed. "Asia mostly. China, Vietnam, Malaysia." Robert stopped at the front pew, running his fingers lightly over the wood polish. "I visited Lin's village. Saw firsthand what happened after the factory closed. That couldn't have been easy. Harder was visiting the real Anna Chen's parents," Robert said quietly. "Elderly couple living in a 2-room apartment outside Shanghai. They had a shrine to their daughter with her nursing school graduation photo. They offered me tea in the only cup that wasn't chipped." Father Michael felt a pang of empathy for these strangers across the world, grieving a daughter whose identity had become tangled in such an extraordinary web. "What did you tell them?" he asked. "The truth. That their daughter was respected and loved by her colleagues. That her death was mourned." Robert's face softened with the memory. "I didn't tell them about Lin. They've suffered enough." Father Michael nodded, understanding the mercy in that omission. "I also established a nursing scholarship in Anna's name at her former hospital," Robert continued. "And a microfinance program in Lin's village to help families start small businesses." He gave a self-deprecating smile. "Trying to put band-aids on bullet wounds, I suppose." "It's more than most would do," Father Michael said. "Especially considering what happened to you." Robert glanced toward the altar where, half a year earlier, his life had imploded so spectacularly. "I've had a lot of time to think about forgiveness," he said slowly. "Not just forgiving Lin, but the larger systems that created her, that put us on a collision course." He pulled an envelope from his coat pocket. "I visited her last week. At the Federal Correctional Institution in Dublin." Father Michael raised his eyebrows in surprise. "How was that?" "Surreal." Robert turned the envelope over in his hands. "She looked smaller somehow. Without the designer clothes and perfect makeup. Just a woman in a beige uniform, sitting across a table in a room that smelled like industrial cleaner." "Did she apologize?" "Yes. Though words seem inadequate for that level of deception." Robert shook his head. "The strange thing is, I believe she actually cares what I think of her. That wasn't part of her plan." "The heart rarely follows plans," Father Michael observed. "She's been helping the FBI dismantle identity theft rings targeting vulnerable immigrants. Apparently, she's quite valuable to them, knows all the tricks, all the players." Robert's mouth quirked in a humorless smile. She's still playing both sides, even now. Or perhaps finding redemption the only way she knows how. Robert handed Father Michael the envelope. She asked me to give you this. Said she wasn't sure you'd accept it directly from her. The envelope was lightweight, addressed simply to Father Michael Walsh in precise handwriting. Father Michael set it aside on the pew. "I'll read it later," he said. Robert nodded, then turned to look around the church at the Christmas greenery, the Advent candles, the nativity scene half assembled on a side table. "Will you be leading midnight mass on Christmas Eve?" "As always." "I might come," Robert said, surprising them both. "I've been thinking a lot about faith lately. About how you recognized the truth when I couldn't see it." "I just listened to evidence," Father Michael demurred. "Anyone would have." "No," Robert interrupted. "Most people would have looked the other way. Avoided the messiness, the scandal. You chose truth, knowing it would hurt." After Robert left, promising to return for Christmas services, Father Michael sat alone in the gathering twilight of the church. He opened Lynn's letter carefully, unsure what to expect. "Father Walsh, I have written and destroyed this letter 17 times. No words seem adequate for what I need to say, but I will try anyway. First, I am sorry for desecrating your church with my deception. Sacred spaces should remain untouched by the kind of darkness I brought into them. Second, I want you to know that while my identity was false, many of my actions were genuine. The children I comforted at the hospital, the elderly patients I sat with during their final hours, that was the real me, or at least parts of me that existed alongside the deception. When I came to your town, I was hollowed out by hatred and the need for vengeance. I had been that way for so long that I no longer remembered how to be anything else. My plan was perfect on paper: seduce the billionaire, marry him, divorce him, take his money, destroy his heart. Simple mathematics of pain. What I didn't calculate was how it would feel to be treated with kindness. To be part of a community. To be Anna Chen, not just wearing her name, but living in the goodness she embodied. I began to disappear into the role, to forget where Lynn ended and Anna began. With Robert, I started by pretending to fall in love. By the end, I was pretending not to be in love. The irony is not lost on me. You saw through me when no one else did. You protected Robert from a woman who had already begun to protect him in her own twisted way. I had started finding excuses to delay the divorce plans, to stay with him longer. Perhaps you saved us both from an even more painful end. I will serve my time and then be deported. Justice, by American standards. When I return to China, I will have nothing again, just as I had nothing when this began. Perfect symmetry. But I will have memories of being Anna Chen. Of doing good work. Of being loved by a good man. Perhaps that will be enough to build something new. With sincere regret and gratitude, Lin Wei. Father Michael folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his prayer book. Outside, snow fell more heavily now, coating St. Catherine's in a blanket of pristine white, nature's way of covering the scars of the past, if only temporarily. In 2 weeks, Robert would return for Christmas Eve service. The real Anna Chen's parents would receive monthly support from an anonymous donor. Lin Wei would continue her prison sentence, her future uncertain but perhaps not entirely without hope. And Father Michael would continue doing what he had always done, creating space for truth, painful though it might be, and for the possibility of redemption that sometimes followed the hardest revelations. The church stood silent around him, bearing witness to it all the deceptions and revelations, the brokenness and healing that made up the messy, complicated business of being human. Some truths reveal themselves only in the aftermath of devastation. Father Michael, Robert, Lynn, and even the deceased Anna became unwitting players in a modern morality tale that transcended its scandalous surface to reveal deeper truths about identity, justice, and the complex architecture of the human heart. What began as revenge transmuted, against all odds, into something more complicated, where genuine feeling grew within the framework of deception, where exploitation gave birth to unexpected compassion. Lin Wei came seeking justice for past wrongs but found herself transformed by the very role she had stolen, discovering shards of genuine connection within her elaborate performance. Robert's journey from betrayed billionaire to clear-eyed philanthropist reminds us that sometimes our greatest growth comes through our most painful losses. His willingness to see beyond his personal hurt to the systemic injustices that shaped Lin's choices represents a rare emotional evolution, acknowledging both his victimhood and his privilege. Perhaps the most poignant message lies in how easily we accept the identities people present to us. We rarely question the narratives offered by those we love, preferring comfortable fiction to uncomfortable truth. The butterfly tattoo, copied but not quite perfectly, becomes a powerful metaphor for how deception so often contains fragments of authenticity that make it convincingly real. In the end, this story asks us to consider whether a feeling remains genuine when its foundation was false. Can something authentic emerge from artifice? Can masks worn long enough become true faces? The Church, which has witnessed countless vows both kept and broken, offers no simple answers, only the quiet space to ask the questions that matter most. If this story of deception, redemption, and the complex nature of truth resonated with you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone whose life has been touched by betrayal or who struggles with the complicated reality that good and evil often coexist within the same heart. This isn't just a sensational scandal but a mirror reflecting our own capacity for self-deception and our hunger for connection, even when it comes wrapped in comfortable lies. What masks do you wear? What identities have you accepted without question? These are the conversations worth having. Our world increasingly blurs the lines between authentic and performed selves. Social media profiles become carefully curated identities. Relationships develop based on partial truths. Perhaps Lin Wei's elaborate deception differs only in degree, not kind, from the small fictions we all maintain. If you found value in Father Michael's moral courage or Robert's journey toward a more nuanced understanding of justice, consider how these principles might illuminate your own relationships and choices. Truth may wound initially, but secrets fester eternally. Remember, authenticity requires tremendous courage, forgiveness demands superhuman strength, and redemption begins with facing our darkest motivations honestly. The most transformative question isn't whether someone has deceived you, but whether you've been complicit in your own deception.